After you watch this, you'll never need to watch another video on the passive voice again. It's got everything, from the basics to the harder rules to the really, really hard C2 English rules. There are 25 rules in total in this video. We'll start with the simplest and we'll move through to the advanced English grammar rules for the passive. Number 1. The basics. In normal English sentences, we start with the subject, then you have the verb, and then some words afterwards, such as the object. In this example, the sun heats the earth, which means the sun makes the earth hotter. But we can also change this word order and make a sentence which is called the passive. Here, the object goes at the beginning, then the verb, then the subject. In this example, the earth is heated by the sun. We add the verb to be and we add by. We can change the active voice into the passive voice by following these steps. First of all, move the object to the front of the sentence. Then move the subject to the back. Then add by before the subject. Change the verb to the past participle. And include the verb to be as an auxiliary verb. And the verb to be is the verb that now takes the tense. So here the verb to be is in the present simple. An extra note is that you can actually remove the subject with by completely and just have the object followed by the verb. You can convert the passive back to the active by following these steps in reverse. Simply move the subject back to the beginning, move the object to the end, take away to be and by, and return the verb to its original tense form. The passive can be used in any tense. Here's how you do it for some of the tenses. Here's the present simple, present continuous, past simple, present perfect, future with will, and with modal verbs. Notice with will and would, which are modal verbs, to be stays in the infinitive form afterwards. For the other tenses, the verb to be changes according to the normal rules for that tense. However, some sentences cannot be changed into the passive, or if they can, there are certain rules to follow. And the rest of this video is going to look at when you can make that change from active voice to passive voice and how you do it. First of all, sentences with two objects. The girl sent me a letter. This has two objects, me and the letter. When there are two objects, as long as an activity is involved, you can usually start a passive sentence with either object. You could say this: I was sent a letter by the girl. Here, me, the object, becomes I, the subject. Or the letter can take the place of the subject. A letter was sent me by the girl, or sent to me by the girl. 6 is be plus ed, not be plus ing. Have a look at this woman. She looks surprised. We could say this sentence: the results of the game were surprising, perhaps surprising to this woman. Now, is this the passive form? We have the verb to be before the verb. Here, no. Be careful. To be followed by the verb and ing is not the passive form. The passive form is where you use verb plus ed. I was surprised by the results of the game. 7 is transitive and intransitive. Compare these two short sentences. I walk, I baked a cake. What's the difference between these sentences grammatically? Well, you'll notice that I walk does not have anything afterwards. It's transitive. We cannot add an object here. We can't say I walked a race, I walked a road. It just stopped as I walk. You could perhaps add some information about the time or where you're walking, but that's not the object. That's adverbial information. The second sentence, though, is what we call transitive because it does have an object. I baked a cake. What did you bake? A cake. So I baked a cake is transitive because it takes an object, but I walk is intransitive because it doesn't. How does this affect the passive form? Well, I walk cannot be passive. Intransitive verbs cannot be converted into the passive form. They have to stay active. However, I baked a cake can be passive. A cake was baked by me. However, some verbs are not obviously transitive or intransitive. For example, the verb to run. In one of these sentences, the verb to run has no object. I run every day. Every day is not an object. That simply tells us the frequency. But in the second example, I run a shop means I'm the owner of a shop and the shop is the object. What do we do here? Well, we follow a similar principle. Where there is no object, we cannot use the passive, but where there is an object, we can. So I run a shop can be changed into the passive form. A shop is run by me. There are also different rules for the passive depending upon whether you're talking about an activity or a state. Let's compare two examples here. First of all, let's look at this book. This book tells a story. Because there is an activity here, the verb tell involves communicating information from one place to another. You can make this sentence passive. A story is told by this book. However, look at this example here. The book seems a guaranteed winner. Now, the verb seem is not an activity. It's what we call a state verb. It's to do with describing. In this case, we cannot make seem passive. Seem is not an activity. It's a state verb. Therefore, it must always stay in the active voice and not be changed into the passive voice. 10 is dummy subjects. What do I mean by this? Well, look at the picture here. What can you see? This is the planet Mars. And it is known that people do not live on Mars. Look at the structure at the beginning of the sentence. It is known that. What does it mean here? We've got the passive form. We have to be, is, and known, which is the past participle of known. So it's a passive form with it at the beginning. What's happening? Well, what's happening here is that it points to the information that's underlined. People do not live on Mars. So it is known that, well, it, the subject, really means the information after is known that. It means people do not live on Mars. It is known that people do not live on Mars. People do not live on Mars doesn't make a very good subject, so we replace it with it at the beginning of the sentence, and that introduces the fact that something is known. What is that something? People do not live on Mars. However, there are some possible problems. Look at these sentences here. Both John and Jane competed for the trophy. It was won in the final match. But who won? It's not clear. The problem with using it sometimes is you need to make sure there are nouns that it can refer to clearly. Here we have both John and Jane. Two subjects in the previous sentence. We also have a trophy. So we have three nouns in the previous sentence. It refers to the trophy, but it's not clear who won the match. There's not enough information here. So be careful when using it. Sometimes using it means the reader has a problem finding the right information to know the final situation that you are describing. What about when we're using the word being? The present participle of to be with the passive. Well, there are some considerations to make. Now, usually you can just follow normal rules. So, for example, if you say is being to mean the present continuous, this is okay. So do you know someone who has a large YouTube following? The YouTuber is being followed by millions of viewers. So this is a present situation. It's happening now. We need to use the present continuous. So we use is as our tense marker, and then we want the present continuous of the verb to be, is being. That's okay. Is there a problem with this sentence though? They had been being followed by millions of viewers. Now grammatically, this looks okay. It's the present perfect and in the continuous form. So it's grammatically correct, but it is usually avoided. It's too confusing to have the past participle been next to the present participle being. People don't tend to use this in everyday English. Now we're going to look at omission. This is when you leave words out of a sentence which are normally there. Have a look at this sentence here. Salmon which are found in the Atlantic Ocean tend to be of very high quality. So salmon is a fish. It lives in the Atlantic Ocean and in other places too. And when you find it in the Atlantic Ocean, there's really good salmon there. Notice we're using the passive form which are found. Now what does which refer to? Well, which refers back to the salmon. And here we can do something special with omission. We can actually leave which are out. When the subject is the same in both clauses, the passive can be shortened. Salmon, not which are found, but salmon found in the Atlantic Ocean tend to be of very high quality. So there are two clauses here. Found in the Atlantic Ocean tend to be of very high quality. The subject of both clauses is salmon. And when that's the case, we can leave these words out, the relative pronoun and the verb to be, and just go straight from salmon to the past participle. And this works in defining relative clauses. That means that the clause after the noun defines the noun. So we're not talking about all salmon, we're just talking about the salmon found in the Atlantic Ocean. But there are also things you can do to create omission in non-defining relative clauses, where the information is just extra. It doesn't limit the noun. Let me explain. Look at this sentence here. Penguins, which are found in the southern hemisphere, always stay in the same pairs for life. So here we are talking about all penguins. We don't mean just the penguins in the southern hemisphere. We mean that all penguins are in the southern hemisphere. We're describing all penguins, not just some penguins. This is called a non-defining relative clause because the relative clause gives us information that is about everything to do with the noun, not just some of the noun. What can we do here? Well, again, we can omit the relative pronoun and the verb to be. But with the non-defining relative clauses, we could do something else as well, and that's this. Found in the southern hemisphere, penguins always stay in the same pairs for life. What's happened here? Well, in non-defining passive clauses, these can be shortened and also moved to the front of the sentence. And here we have what's called a participle clause. It starts the sentence and then it's followed by a comma and then you have the rest of the sentence afterwards. Grammar books might call this a participle clause or a participle phrase. But the key thing here is we have the past participle starting a clause or some information that then is ended with a comma and then you have the rest of the sentence. It's another way of organising the sentence using the passive form, but it has to have this omission when you do it. 15 is passives with object infinitives. What does this mean? Look at these two sentences. I wanted to see her. I wished that he would come. The object infinitive here is I wanted to see her. Now, normally with an object infinitive, we don't usually use the passive. We can't change I wanted to see her into the passive form. It's also true with that clauses as well. I wish that he would come. We cannot change this into the passive, except that is in certain conditions. Here is a way in which we can make the object infinitive into a passive form. One way is when there is an activity and there is an object before the infinitive. Look again at the sentence. Not he told to see her, but he told me to see her. We have the object me before the infinitive, before to see. And in this case, we can use the passive. I was told by him to see her. 17 is moving object noun phrases. Look at these two sentences here. My uncle cooked a meal that contained fish. My uncle cooked a meal on Sunday. Now, in both sentences, the object is meal, but we have different information coming after the meal. Which phrase describes the object here? Is it that contained the fish or on Sunday? Well, the phrase that describes the object is that contained the fish. A meal, what do we know about the meal? Oh, it contained fish. So contained fish describes the meal. On Sunday doesn't describe the meal. On Sunday describes the whole sentence, when everything happened. Now, why is this important? Well, it's because of this. If a phrase describes the object, then it must stay next to the object when it moves in the passive form. Look at the passive form below. A meal that contained fish was cooked by my uncle. Here, that contained fish moves to the front of the sentence with a meal. It doesn't stay at the end. The second sentence was an example of an adverbial at the end. It gives information about the whole sentence. My uncle cooked a meal on Sunday. Now, what happens to the position of on Sunday when this becomes the passive? In this case, it's completely different. If a phrase describes the sentence, it does not move with the object in the passive form. It stays where it was. So when we make the second sentence passive, we do the following. A meal was cooked by my uncle on Sunday. Not a meal on Sunday was cooked by my uncle. But we also need to look more deeply at what happens when you have multiple verbs in a phrase, because we can't always change them into the passive. Here are two examples to help you. First of all, look at the following. I needed to leave the event. Can I change it into the passive and say the event needed to be left by me? Well, we wouldn't normally do this. Although grammatically it seems right, we don't do this in practice. We often avoid making passive sentences with two verbs next to each other. Except that is when there is active participation upon the subject by that second verb. Here, the passive is more natural and more likely to be used. Look at the example at the bottom. I needed to make the dinner. The dinner needed to be made by me. Let's consider the difference between to leave and to make. So leave the event means go out of somewhere. Make the dinner involves you doing something to the dinner. When you leave the event, you don't do something to the event. But when you make the dinner, you do something to the dinner. In this case, the passive is much more naturally going to be used by native speakers. Passive and with. Use with to introduce anything used by the agent. For example, I was surprised by my husband with a bunch of flowers. With introduces what my husband used to surprise me. He used a bunch of flowers. I was surprised by my husband with a bunch of flowers. But you can also, of course, leave out by my husband and simply say, I was surprised with a bunch of flowers. So it's quite common to have a passive form and then with afterwards to introduce what was used by the agent. 21 looks at a very specific structure. There, followed by the passive form, and then another to be. Here's an example. There is believed to be ancient ruins in this area. What's happened here? Well, there is believed to be, is believed is a passive structure, to be followed by the past participle. And what it means here is people believe that there is. So if we say there is believed to be, people believe that there is. We could change believe for other verbs. There is known to be. People know that there is. 22 looks at something called object complements. Have a look at this example. The tutor had the highest qualifications. Students considered her a genius. Now focus on her, a genius. This doesn't happen very often, but sometimes the object then has a complement afterwards. What do we mean by this? Well, what we mean is the noun a genius is actually describing the object. It's not what's affected by the object. Usually when we have two objects, one thing affects the other. He gave her a car. The car is affected by her actions, but not here. Here, the second object simply describes the first object. Students considered her a genius. So how does this affect the passive form? We can make the passive here as follows. She was considered a genius by the students. So here we have the first object goes to the front of the sentence. Then the verb was considered, and then the object complement comes afterwards, and then by the students. It's also possible to have by the students followed by the object complement, a genius, but the most common way to say this is as follows. She was considered a genius by the students. Object complement, then by, and the subject. By is not the only word that we use to introduce the subject when it comes at the end of the sentence. Consider some of the following examples where by is replaced with another preposition. Firstly, through. And this introduces the means to achieve the action. It was organised through an agency. In other words, you've got something you want to do, but you have to go through someone else to get there. I want to achieve this activity. It gets to the end here, but someone helps me in the middle, and that's called the agency. It goes through them. It was organised not by an agency, but through an agency. By is possible, but it doesn't capture the full meaning, that they are helping something to happen rather than doing everything. Another replacement for by is of, and this goes with certain verbs only, such as scared. I am scared of snakes. Now, in most situations, when you have a structure that follows this rule, when you make it passive, you add to back in. He was made to go, not he was made go. And then optionally, you can add the subject by me. But you have to know that there are some exceptions to this. And the major exception is with the verb let. I let him go. Here we do not add to before the go. He was let go becomes the passive. And finally, there are some verbs that are almost always passive. And these verbs are born, repute, and rumour. I was born in 1998. You'll very rarely see this used in the active voice. In the past, it was possible to say, I bore a child. It is used a little bit nowadays, but it's hardly ever used. It's almost always was born, is born, has been born. It's almost always in the passive. Similarly with the verb repute. It is reputed to be the oldest discovery of its kind. Repute is to do with what people say about something. But you'll hardly ever see this used in an active sense. And also with rumour when it's a verb form. Rumour can be a noun, but in the verb form, it's almost always a passive structure. It is rumoured, people think in other words, that the king will visit next year. So those were the 25 rules for using the passive. But there's one more question we still need to answer. Why do we use the passive at all? Well, there are some good reasons why you should use the passive in some situations. The first reason is the passive is more formal. When you use the passive, it sounds more professional or academic. So if you want to increase the formality in your writing, make it sound more academic, more businesslike, then consider using some sentences in the passive. Another reason to use the passive is to focus on the subject. If I have a sentence such as, I saw a person walking down the street, but I want to emphasize the person more, then I may put the person at the front of the sentence. Instead, I could say, the person was seen walking down the street. Now the person's at the beginning, more focus is on that person. It becomes the subject of the sentence, the subject of what I'm talking about. Another reason is to avoid using the subject. This is useful when someone makes a mistake. Perhaps you know someone who accidentally drove their car and hit a wall. Instead of telling someone, I hit the wall, you might feel embarrassed, and it might be easier to say this instead. The wall was hit. But you can leave out the subject in the passive, so you don't have to say it was you at all. It's less embarrassing and it protects your identity. That's another reason why you could use the passive. You could also use the passive to avoid repetition. If you have a long paragraph where you say, I did this, I did that, I did another thing, you can change the order to avoid it being so repetitive and always starting with the same subject. Or you could use the passive to focus on the process, not the person. Instead of saying, for example, first I got the ingredients for the meal, then I put the ingredients together, then I put the ingredients in the oven, then I. Instead of doing that, where we focus on the person, perhaps we're more interested in communicating the process. In this case, it's better to use the passive. Ingredients were taken out of the cupboard. Ingredients were mixed together. It was placed in the oven. The meal was taken out of the oven. Do you see how we're now focusing on the process, not the person? And if we're interested in the process, that could be the best thing to do.